social justice issues, corporate malfeasance, the government breaking the law to look into our private lives. And I know that at EFF, one of the main responses to these kinds of problems has been litigation and has been to go to the courts. And I'm curious to hear why you think that that is a good tactic, because we have many tactics at our disposal. There's direct action, there's calling our Congress critters. There's all kinds of ways that we can influence the political process. So why the law, why the courts, and how can ordinary people participate in that?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I want to do just a fundamental constitutional question at the centerpiece of how we're going to interact with our technology that can make all the other questions easier. And the second reason is that most of the other actions that you might want to take in order to exercise your self-governance and have your voice heard require some kind of legal protection, right? I mean, we talk about direct action, but the reason that you can do direct action and not end up with very, very long jail sentences in the United States compared to other places around the world is because the Constitution says you can. All the hackers who EFF represents, who tell us all the things about the security problems and the surveillance, if we don't get the law right, they're not going to be able to do that. So I often say to EFF that we're kind of the plumbers of freedom, right? We're trying to get the obstacles out of the way so that all the other things you can do to exercise your rights in the digital world can really flow freely. And so I think for both of those reasons, EFF was grounded in the law. And but I also, at this point, we build technology, we do Action Center, we support a lot of people who do direct action, we support a lot of people who do direct action to protect themselves so they can continue to do direct action, and all sorts of other things. So while we're firmly grounded in the law, and that's my background, the organization has really tried to grow to meet to build a lot of different tools in the toolbox to address the problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's easy to forget just how powerful states are. They have a lot of resources. And in a fight where you are trying to, say, use cryptography to be free in a state that is illegitimate, you have to use cryptography and the privacy tools associated with it absolutely perfectly, as do everyone you communicate with, and never make a mistake. And when you get tired or distracted, you don't get to call in another you to spell you off and manage your operational security for you while you're distracted and taking care of your kids or dealing with the flu. And your adversary in the form of the state has 3 shifts of people who can watch you, right? And when one of them gets a little tired and gets screen burn and needs to take 15 minutes off to go to the bathroom, they can swap someone else in. And so in the long run, your ability to use cryptographic tools, say, to defend yourself against an illegitimate state, you will always lose, right? Because you need to make one mistake, they have to find one mistake you've made. They get to make lots of mistakes, provided that they can still catch that one mistake you've made, and then they get to roll up you and all of your friends and put you all in jail and torture you and so on. And so without a legitimate state, the utility of cryptography is to allow you to just have a space in which you can organize to try and make your state legitimate. But unless you can attain that kind of democratic accountability, unless you can attain that kind of legitimacy, you're always going to lose. And so I would draw a great distinction between, advocating for new laws or litigating. I think they're both in the domain of policy. We don't do a lot of advocating for laws, partly because I think of the tax status as a 501c3, but also because, I don't know if you've noticed, but Congress hasn't had a very functional lawmaking process for effectively the entire time I've lived in the United States, which is like 18 years since I moved here from Canada. And so it's just not an easy path to go down, and God speak to the people who do it. And both domains are good. Larry Lessig, take a drink, is one of the great cyber lawyers, and he divides all the areas in which we can act to change the world into 4 categories or 4 directions. We can do code, we can do law, we can do norms, and we can do markets. And they all feed back into each other. And EFF does all of these things. We sometimes advise businesses who are building up stakeholders for good policies. We sometimes do activist interventions where we just try to convince people that they should expect more or demand better. I mean, this book this evening is a normative intervention. Sometimes we sue governments. sometimes we act on laws. And so we move in all four of these axes. And I'm someone who grew up in big cities, and so I've always enjoyed great public transit. I've never been much of a driver. But 3 years ago, I moved to Southern California and bought a car. And now I have to park. And I really suck at parking. I'm no spatial sense. And when I park, I do a lot of backing and filling. I move like an inch. I turn the wheel all the way around, and I move as far as I can to get 1 inch of play. And then I turn the wheel as far as I can in the other direction and reverse back to get another inch of play. And oftentimes we will run up against the limit of what we can do with the law. And so we'll do something with technology to try and get us an inch. But that inch is in service of maybe getting another inch in which we can talk about norms and build some stakeholders, because now there are people using a technology like Privacy Badger who expect that the websites they visit aren't spying on them. And so now maybe we can go back and ask for a law that corresponds to that new norm. And so 1 inch at a time, moving the wheel on these four axes, code, law, norms, and markets, we're able to edge towards, stepwise, towards a better world. And ultimately, I think, in that hierarchy, even though I'm an activist at EFF and, activists and lawyers, we have different approaches to things. I think that unless we can turn the activism into law, then we're always going to be fighting a rearguard action.
So I wanted to kind of pick at something that you said sort of early in this conversation, which is you were talking about crypto, and you were saying, look, like you can do this encryption, but like ultimately, you also need democracy or some kind of democratic process. And I feel like, here in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and Silicon Valley, there's a lot of belief or maybe mythology around the idea that we could design the perfect freedom technology, right? You could make an internet that protected all of us, that no one could use against us, that wouldn't surveil us, that would, protect whatever, protect our rights, protect whatever it is that you want to have protected. It sounds like you guys maybe wouldn't agree with that. I mean, is it possible to have a technology that like actually protects us, or do we always have to be thinking about that technology in the context of social norms or legal battles?
I think that we can make technology that is a hell of a lot better at protecting us than what we have right now. I mean, to me, the original sin of the internet was that it was not built with the idea that security was not built in from the beginning. We're having to bolt it on afterwards in a lot of really clunky ways. So I think we can do better. I think we can do much, much better. But I just don't think that you can really ever completely future-proof a technology. There's always a cat and mouse game. And that's bad news for freedom, but it's also bad news for repression, right? Like the fact that we're, that they can't build a repressive regime that we can't undermine, just the same way we can't build a freedom machine that they can't undermine. But that doesn't mean it's always even. Like we can do much, much better. We can build technologies that serve us, we can build technologies and systems where the business model isn't about spying on you. We can pass laws, and we've gone, just in the last few years, the Supreme Court has started recognizing digital data has Fourth Amendment protections, and the number of times that the cops have to go get a warrant before they come after you for your location information is getting better and better. So it's not like just because we can't ever, it's not a situation where either we win everything or we lose everything. We can make it much, much better, but I don't know that I'm not a technologist, I'm just a country lawyer, but I don't think you can ever build a technology that is so great at protecting freedom that nobody ever could undermine it. It's always up to us.
Yeah, I would think that like the way to square that circle is if you can build a technology that creates pluralistic power centers where one guy doesn't wake up in the morning. Let me backtrack a second. I have a friend who went and worked for Facebook in a really senior role. And when he took the job, we had dinner, and I was like, "You're gonna hate it." And he's like, "No, it's gonna be great because I'm gonna go in and help you." What if nobody of goodwill ever works for Facebook? How will Facebook ever improve? And the fact that I'm getting paid an awful lot of money has nothing to do with my feelings. So I saw him last year, and he was like, he'd taken all the money, moved to France, and quit his job at Facebook. You know, the thing is that the thing that gave me comfort was waking up and realizing that none of those people were any smarter than me, and I'm kind of stupid. And so they're not supervillains. They're just dum-dums who are in charge of the social lives of 2 billion people, right? And I'm like, of course they're dum-dums in charge of the lives of 2 billion people, because there is no one who is so qualified that they should be in charge of the lives of 2 billion people. Anyone in that role is relative to the scope of the role a dum-dum, right? And so if we have pluralistic power centers where you don't ask people to do these superhuman things to regulate the social lives of 2 billion people, and instead allow for a pluralistic diffusion of power where people can form groups and push back and do that hard project that the human race has been trying to do since we first started to divide labor, which is to figure out how to work together to do more than one person can do to achieve some end that is to our common interest, then maybe we can hold states to account using technology so that, you know, not that we can secede from them, not nerd determinism, not, you know, our superior technology makes your inferior laws irrelevant, but rather our superior technology allows us to influence these inferior laws and make them better.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of zoom in on the main social problem that you're thinking about in this volume, which is privacy and surveillance, and then maybe think about some solutions. But first I want to talk about a phrase that you both use in your pieces in this book, which is privacy nihilism. And it's a very useful idea for thinking about kind of where we're at as a society in thinking about privacy and thinking about surveillance. You know, we've kind of reached a point where people accept that their privacy has been taken from them online. We know that it's happening. We know that Facebook is harvesting our data, and it isn't just Facebook. It's a ton of different services, but Facebook is the most famous example. But we don't really feel like, we sort of feel paralyzed. Like, what do we do now? So I wonder if you guys can talk about that, like that problem of nihilism and kind of getting out of that moment of like realization that everything is fucked and we've got to go forward.
Well, I got that phrase from Eva Galperin, who works with me, who is, you know, a serious God person. So she named it. Yeah, she knows her nihilism, but and she's amazing. But I think that, you know, I feel a little responsible. I feel like, you know, at EFF we've been telling people like, it's going to go bad if you're not careful. We have to do this thing, otherwise things are going to go really bad. Now things are going really bad, and I'm like, oh, now we have to switch. We have to be able to tell people how to get out of this situation, right? We've successfully convinced you all that things are really bad, and so I feel some responsibility to try to head out, because I still don't think that the technology cares. I think that the technology can be built to work with you or work against you, and we have to grab control again. So I think some of it is to try to, it is about envisioning a future. I sent you a note earlier that, you know, gender politics aside, I'd like to get back to the Jetsons and away from Black Mirror. And,
except for that one episode of Black Mirror.
I'm not
just had to put in a plug.
But I do think that we have to start envisioning what a tech future works. We have to start demanding it, and we have to start supporting the people who are building it. There are plenty of people who are building a better future. Most of them live in the Bay Area too. My friends at the Internet Archive, Wikimedia, people who are building the distributed web. You know, our friend Moxie built Signal. Like, there are Tor project I'm on the board of. Like, there are all sorts of places where people are regaining control, and I think we have to support them, and we have to you know, vote with our attention with those kinds of tools, and then make them better. But I don't think that, I mean, look, people are feeling very surrendery, but nobody's throwing their phones away. You know, like, and nobody's deciding, well, you know, I'm just not going to use the internet. Like, you can't do that, right? You need to get a job, you have to use the internet. So we have to make it better. And the good news is lots of people have already been working to do that for a while, and we just have to find them and support them.
So when Michael Weinberg was at Public Knowledge, he's moved on since, but he wrote a paper about copyright patents and 3D printing, and it has my favorite title for any law paper I've ever read, which is "This will all be so great if we don't fuck it up." And for me, like, you know, there's this story about where groups like EFF came from that you sometimes hear people say, like, do you remember when those cyber utopians said that the internet would automatically make things amazing? And so, and now it turns out that they were wrong. And you know, I spent a lot of time around those cyber utopians, you know, and I never heard any of them say things would automatically be amazing. I don't think you start an organization like EFF because you think things will automatically be amazing. You start an organization like EFF because you're terrified that things will be really great if we don't fuck them up, and if we do, things will be really terrible, right? That the power of the internet to make things wonderful is also the power of the internet to turn into a perfect surveillance system. That's why all of those fights were so important back in the old days when people said, why are you arguing about the internet? And you know, the piece I wrote for McSweeney's is about this tension between what I call the moment of peak indifference, which is the moment at which like all the policy that you've accrued by doing a thing that is wrong starts to come due, right? People start to get bitten in the ass by their policy debt. They start to suffer huge breaches. Equifax doxes the largest country in the world, or the largest country in the hemisphere, and then you know, people get stalked and people have their lives ruined and so on. And at a certain point, the job of people like us switches from being convincing you that things could go bad if we don't try and defend them, to convincing you that it's not too late to save them. And that's a hard thing, right? This is the same problem that everyone who spent 20 years shouting in the wilderness about climate change is now facing, because most people now believe in climate change, but a certain number of people are saying, well, it's too late, right? They're like the person who's like, well, all those years you told me I was going to get cancer from smoking, I guess I should have listened, but now that I've got cancer, why stop, right? And convincing people that it's not too late to give up hope, it's a hard problem. And I think that there's room for dystopias and utopias in that, right? That the dystopia can be a vaccine. You know, for 50 years we had this useful term to describe why it would be a bad idea to put a camera everywhere. It was Orwellian, right? And that was just as useful as every utopia that you've read in terms of helping steer us towards a better future. And I think that it's a mistake to assume that a utopia is a place where things don't go wrong. I think a utopia is a place that when things go wrong, we fix them, right? That we can work together to get the machine started gracefully again, instead of having it sink. You know, the engineers who build systems on the assumption that they'll never break down are not good engineers, they're idiots, right? That's why you don't put lifeboats on the Titanic, because it's unsinkable, right? Those people, their careers sink with the ships they build. But engineers who assume things will go wrong are not pessimists. They're people who do good design and they try to get things started again. And so this is where I think we can split the difference between utopia and dystopia, which is to tell stories about things going wrong and people pulling together to make them better.
So one of the, yes, that was awesome. So one of the issues with surveillance that I feel like is dealt with quite well in this volume is the fact that surveillance is not, it doesn't affect all of us equally. You talk about this in your piece, Cindy. Jenna Wortham has a great piece in here about this. Malkia Cyril's piece is amazing on this topic about how black bodies are surveilled more often, immigrant bodies, Muslim bodies become much more subject to profiling and subject to data gathering by hostile state forces or state adversaries. And so that to me suggests that when we think about solutions, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. You know, like what works for me as like a white lady living in Lily Valley is not going to be the same thing for somebody who's an undocumented immigrant living in this neighborhood. So how do we kind of get at that? Like how do we think through that issue of trying to come up with solutions or even messages about like how to cope with these surveillance problems at the border or at home, you know, and make sure that we're not just talking to like white humans.
Yeah, this is a really important point and one that we really wanted to make sure was made in this piece, in the thing. I think that the first thing is to, of course, recognize that it's true. And it's definitely true for people of color, and Virginia Eubanks' piece in here is really right on about poverty, right? Access to welfare, social services, those people have been surveilled. She goes back to the 1800s, she goes back even earlier than I knew about this idea that the thing that you trade away for your government supporting you if you're poor is your privacy and your dignity and your ability to operate without being watched. So I think the first thing we have to do is name it. Then I think the second thing we have to do is to not fall for it. Like, oh, it's just about surveilling terrorists, or it's just about surveilling, bad people, because we watch the march of these technologies from the battlefield to domestic to all of us at some point. And that we kind of tend to fall for it, that it's just about those people, and I think the recognition that it isn't, and it never has been, and it never will be. And even if it was, we shouldn't let it happen, right? It's one of these, it's a social control thing. So I think we have to stand up earlier, and I think it's really important that we do so, and that we have these conversations, and that we recognize the disproportionate impact. And at EFF, we're really working hard to think about how do we reach out. The early internet really was a overwhelmingly a white male demographic, or South Asian male as well, and that I think there have been some blind spots about this stuff that we need to name, and then we need to partner with those people to direct what we do next. I think the other thing that would be the height of arrogance would be for me to sit up here and say what we needed to do. That's why Malkia's Woods and Alvaro Bedoya and people who work inside these communities need to be the ones who are leading that, and people like me need to figure out how to listen, but also how to take what we know about how the technology works and the networks work, and educate those folks so that they have the tools to protect themselves.
Yeah, I think that understanding the difference between utopia and dystopia is the locus of power, the locus of control. And so good technology and bad technology are almost always about who's got their finger on the button, and depending on where you sit in our kind of social hierarchy, you are less likely to have your finger on the button. Doug Rushkoff has a piece in this, but he wrote another thing for Medium about going to a conference of hedge fund people, hedge fund dudes, who had a panel on what they would do when the event happened, by which they mean the end of civilization. Specifically, there was a long discussion about how they would solve the problem of how they would keep the guards they hired from killing them and taking their food. And they concluded that if they had a biometric system, then the guards would have to keep them alive or they'd starve to death, because then the food lockers wouldn't open without their living fingers. So this is pretty dystopian, right? So then, imagine you're someone like me who's wrestled with your weight all your life, and you try a fad diet like I've been known to do, and you go on one of these intermittent fasting diets, and you put a lock on your fridge that only opens when you're supposed to eat. So it's literally the same technology. And the difference between the utopian and dystopian was whose finger is on the button, right? Who gets to make the call? And so unless we attend to the power dynamic, unless we acknowledge that there are some people for whom a negotiation consists of, by being dumb enough to pass this threshold, you agree that we're allowed to come over to your house and punch your grandmother and wear your underwear, make long distance calls, and eat all the food in your fridge, to disagree, run away screaming, no, 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 I agree, right? Unless we acknowledge that there are people who don't get a choice, right, who are coerced into every agreement by economic circumstance, by state power, by being dragged in front of a judge when they're 3 years old in an immigration court and asked if they understand the immigration proceedings and asked whether they agree to a bunch of things stipulated by the prosecution. Unless we acknowledge these power dynamics, we can't make the security work. And all security forever is about threat modeling, right? It's always about understanding who wants to attack you. There's no such thing as being secure. There's only being secure from some attack in some circumstance. And so, in some ways, I think that it's not a failure of the method, it's a failure of the application, because security professionals have forever understood that it's always about threat models. They just haven't ever empathized with the threat models of people who don't look like them, at least not to a sufficient degree. And you know, I heard Dan Savage talk about the advances in the rights of queer people relative to the advances in the rights of people of color in America. And he hypothesized something really interesting. He said that queer people are evenly distributed among different kinds of privilege. That whether you're rich or you're poor, you have a sort of 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 chance of being queer. And as a result, there was a social power there that was able to affect some change. And it reminded me of something that Snowden said that I quoted in my piece, that 50 years ago, there's a lot of stuff that we do today that we take for granted that was a felony, right? Smoking weed, being the product of an interracial relationship, being gay, and that in the last, in living memory, right, we've gone from those things being felonies to people who think of them as immoral or wrong being social pariahs, right? And the way that we affected that change is not by compelling everyone who had a secret about who they were and what they did to immediately tell everyone else about that secret. The way that we got there is by allowing people to choose the time and manner of the disclosure about the salient facts of their lives, to recruit allies from around them, from people who had more privilege than they did, from people who could speak with them, and to come out in the manner of their choosing. And unless we preserve that space for people to come out in the manner of their choosing, then there are people that you love right now, people who are really important to you, who have a secret that they haven't told you. And without preserving that space, they'll go to that grave with that secret in their heart, right? You will never know them, and they will sorrow for it. And so, in that sense, privacy becomes a good that is for all of us, right? That everyone knows someone who is queer in some way, whether not just in a sexual way, but in all the ways that we can be different. And unless we can preserve the privacy for people to do that, to be that way, and then to choose when they tell us about it, then we can never be sure that the people that we love are realized and fulfilled and happy, and that we can know them.
I want to ask one final question, and we're going to open it up to you guys to ask questions too. And that is about this idea that I think comes up in the interview that you did, Cindy, which is this idea that privacy is a communal right, which really goes against, I think, the way that we normally think about privacy as being kind of about my personal secrets, for example. I wonder if you can talk about what that means. What does it mean legally, but also culturally, for privacy to be a communal right?
Yeah, I think Alvaro said that in the conversation that we had, and I think that what he meant, and I'm hesitate because he's smarter than me, is that well, first of all, I agree completely with Cory that privacy isn't about whether you keep something secret or you tell somebody about it. It's about who decides. It's about control, right? And so then your privacy and your ability that it takes a community for people to feel like they have privacy. They need to feel safe. They need to feel like they have control over what they reveal and what they don't. And that really isn't something that you can do all by yourself. Certainly not in our modern society, and I don't even think in an older society. It's a societal value that we're going to let people be different, and we're going to let people decide what they tell us about themselves and who they want to be in the world. And I think that it takes a community to do that. I also think that about surveillance, that the kind of privacy that kind of more individual privacy that we need. Like, you can't have privacy if you're organizing something and the other people you're talking to don't keep that secret. In the EFF we say privacy is a team sport, right? Because absolute privacy, where you don't tell anybody anything, you can't really do anything with that, right? Like, we sit alone in a shack somewhere, but to really to live a private life and to live a not surveilled life, it takes everybody working together. Encryption is easiest from that, right? I mean, you can encrypt a message, but you can't communicate with anybody unless they use encryption too. We all have to participate in order to make it work. And that's one of the things that gets me frustrated about the kind of, sorry, I can't help this because this is one that drives me crazy. The whole, if you don't have anything to hide, I don't have anything to hide. Well, first of all, that's a very entitled position, right? If you don't have anything to hide, because you don't think society is going to come down hard on you for anything about you, and that only happens to certain people in our society. It does not happen to people who are on the lower side of our society. It only happens to people on the upper side. It very rarely happens to women. So I think that one of the things that is important in that is that, you know, privacy and surveillance and these kinds of rights, they're not just about you. They're about your community and your society. You might not think you have anything to hide. You might be exactly right. You don't have anything to hide. But somebody you love does. Somebody might want to make some change in the world that's controversial. They might have 5 years ago thought that it was important to, you know, or 10 years ago in the city that gay people should get married, or that trans people should be able to use whatever bathroom they want. Those are controversial ideas, and if people who are entitled in society are all looking at this on an individual basis and not thinking about what we need for a society to live together and share things, then it's easy to say, well, individually, I'm entitled in society, I don't need this kind of protection, so I don't care about anybody else's privacy. And I think part of the, you know, part of the message of this book that I hope we were able to get by is that that's not particularly realistic for you, but it's certainly not realistic for at least one person that you love.
And you know, there's another sense, the sense in which privacy is a team sport is really important. Like, there's a very concrete way in which it's true. So I run my own mail server at a rack in a data center in Toronto since the 90s, since before I first moved to San Francisco. And it's administered by a guy who's an amazing, talented network administrator. He used to be the CTO of Wikimedia. All of my email is encrypted. I take it off the server as soon as it arrives. I pop it to my laptop onto my encrypted hard drive, whose backups are only encrypted. And then everyone I correspond with just keeps their email on Gmail. So nothing I do matters. So privacy is a team sport in that sense as well. And there was something else I wanted to say apropos of that. It was, you were talking, oh yeah, so, you know, back to this idea that someone you love has a secret. If the only people who use privacy tools are people who have secrets, then it's not hard for systems of oppression to figure out who has a secret, right? One of the scariest things that's happened in the last 5 years since the Snowden revelations, there was an article published in one of the German magazines by Laura Poitras, and she was documenting the deep packet inspection rules that had been leaked that the NSA used to figure out who to do targeted surveillance of. So the NSA surveils the whole internet, but they have targeted surveillance of some individuals, and they take everything those individuals put on the internet, communicate with, and they store it forever, right? And so I think that when people first encounter the idea of targeted surveillance, they're like, okay, well, they've got a list of jihadis, and they keep their data, or some, you know, high value targets in adversarial governments. It turns out that the rule is, if you've ever searched for how to use Tails or Tor, two common privacy tools, you're targeted, right? And the logic for that, well, I don't know what the logic is because no one from the NSA ever explained it to me. I think the logic for that is, even if we don't know how to break Tails or Tor, if we spy on everything that you do, if you know how to keep a secret, we can spy on all the communications you have with people who don't know how to keep a secret. And so someone who doesn't use Tor or PGP or some other cryptographic tool sends you a message saying, what are we going to do about this protest on Friday? And then you talk to a bunch of people who are way more clued in secret, and the NSA doesn't know what you're saying. But then you pop out another message that says, we're meeting on Friday, right? And so the NSA can infer everything that happened in the black box based on what happened outside of the black box. And so if you are going to be private, then you need to have not just the people who are at risk be private, but you need all the people who are adjacent to the people who are at risk be private. Otherwise, you just listen in on them, and you use what they do to infer what's going on with the people who are using the privacy tools in the middle.
It's this great kind of irony that basically private life depends on public life. Like, you can't have like a private life without a kind of democratic public life and without the participation of public life, which I think is really interesting. So I'm gonna...
Telescopes, we may ban using facial recognition, and it's not that we will prohibit the production of tools that can be used in the course of facial recognition, but we may punish people who use facial recognition in ways that are inconsistent with our values as a democracy.
I remembered what I wanted to say.
I had a question in a second.
Okay. I just wanted to give you guys a heads up about an argument that's going on now and not something kind of almost not to fall for. So one of the things that's going on with facial recognition right now by folks is the idea that facial recognition fails. And it fails especially badly for people of color right now. And that's a really important thing it's an important observation. It's been really useful. My friends at the ACLU ran members of Congress through a facial recognition database, and they determined that the people of color in Congress were much more likely to come up as likely criminals than white people are. It's an important argument, but let's not take it too far, because the answer to that argument is we just need to surveil more people of color, right? And my story that I want to tell you about this is that this was a problem that the Chinese were having with their facial recognition, was that it was not recognizing black faces very well. And so you know what they did? They went to the government of Zimbabwe and they bought all of the driver's license pictures from the government of Zimbabwe so they could train up their facial recognition to recognize black faces better. So the answer to the problem that it doesn't recognize people of color very well, that the technologists will tell you is, well, we just need to feed it more data. We just need to do more surveillance, and then we'll train it up, and then it'll be equally accurate for people of color as it will, I think. So it's okay to make that argument. I just wouldn't rest on it, right? Because it doesn't point us toward what we want, which is keep our faces out of your goddamn database.
So I just had a quick question,
okay.
Cindy, which was you were saying, we've got to say no, don't let law enforcement use facial recognition, which we know they're already doing, right? Like we know people have been identified at protests and at riots or whatever they're being called. Is that possible? Like that legally we can just say like, all right, roll all that shit back. Mm-hmm. You can't use that anymore, even though you already have the software and you already have that technology. You just have to get rid of it, and that's it.
Yep.
Okay.
we would need to make sure that it actually happened, and law enforcement often doesn't do things, but we're going to get rid of.
But once the laws in place, we can sue them if they're doing that.
Say you can't use it, and if they can't use it in a court of law to actually prosecute people, then they still may use it, but you're going to reduce the number of things, right? So then it becomes subject to like an exclusionary rule where there are ways that we can enforce it. Are we ever going to say no, that a rogue cop can never have facial recognition? Of course not. As Cory pointed out, it is a piece of software that's not all that. I mean, it is hard to have enough data to do it well. I think there's a size thing. I don't know that anybody like in their basement, their basement can roll up facial recognition in a way that would be really effective in a broad thing. But it's useful in closed environments. If you want to make sure that the only people on in Apple's super secret place where they're developing the next cool technology are the people who are supposed to work there.
It's the place where they round the corners.
But biometrics have biometric identifiers have roles. I'm not saying that for all uses, but I think for law enforcement the dynamics are bad. And if we wanted to make it illegal and we wanted to make it stick, we just make it illegal and we say you can't use it in a court of law. Now, I would even want to go further because I want to get at the intelligence community, which doesn't often take things to courts of law, but I can get you into my deep geekery of how we do that too.
There's a kind of elephant in the room here, which is that there are a lot of firms that will use facial recognition through the application of a non-negotiated contract or some other kind of like fiction of consent. And we live in a world of extremely concentrated wealth and power, where not just tech, but all of our industries have become very, very concentrated. And we've had lots of stories about why this was, especially when it seemed like tech was kind of the only industry that was getting particularly concentrated. They said it was network effects or first mover effects, which I find implausible because we're not all looking at Alta Vista on our Cray computers. It has to be something more than first movers and network effects. And I think it's that, the Apple II Plus came out the year that Ronald Reagan dismantled antitrust. And then we've had 40 years of no antitrust enforcement. And we've had this growth of power and concentration of power into a small number of hands. And tech may have led the charge, but they weren't the only ones. Everyone's gotten in on the act now. And one of the things that we're going to have to do if we're going to be able to, for example, say to owners of fast food chains that are giant and ubiquitous, or coffee shop chains that are giant and ubiquitous. You're not allowed to use facial recognition at the door, even if you have a sign that says, by entering our premises, you agree to facial recognition. So we're going to have to check their power. And to check their power, we're going to have to do something about wealth and power concentration. And you know, EFF is a small but growing antitrust practice that we've just kicked off this year. It's you know, it's been a missing piece, I think, in the work, and I'm really glad to see it. And it's really important, right? Like, a lot of what we're talking about just comes back to, oh, well, rich people are making policy outcomes that benefit rich people, and they don't reflect evidence, and they don't reflect popular will, and they do reflect the priorities of a tiny minority of people. And until we can change that, we maybe can't change anything else. Maybe we can't change it all at once. Maybe we turn the steering wheel and drive 1 inch towards antitrust, and then turn the steering wheel and drive 1 inch towards technology. But eventually, we're going to have to get all the way clear of antitrust to make the rest of it work.
Eventually, we'll have self-driving cars.
But I do think that trying to figure out how to make competition really work is really important for our digital future. One of, you know, I often think of the big companies and a little bit like I think of my cat, because she's very small and, you know, she's still kind of fierce, but if she was big enough, she'd eat me. That is what has happened, right? You know, Apple was a cute little company, and now it's big enough to eat us. And the same thing with Facebook. If we had multiple ones, if we could leave, if we could vote with our feet, if we could let competition work, if we let the markets part of what Larry's talking about work, we might actually have some better options available, and people could develop better options. And there's a lot of work to be done to try to make that happen. And again, I'm going to call out my friend Brewster Kale and the distributed web work that he's doing is one way to try to think about that. Dealing with antitrust law is another. That's a really hard thing to do. I would also point out that there's a little bit of technology is now the problem, and it's the thing that is, everything is wrong with it. You know, of course everything was right, and now everything's wrong with it. You know, airline mergers, like the lack of competition in the airline industry. We're talking about tech, let's talk about broadband. Right. 2 companies, right? Like, you know, social networks' lack of competition to me is a latecomer to the problem, and lots of our other industries have now shrunk down to 1 or 2 of them as a result of the lack of antitrust. The idea that antitrust only matters if a consumer's price goes up, which is really, it's not like there's no antitrust enforcement, it's just been shrunk to this thing about pricing that doesn't apply to lots and lots of industries. Is the central problem, and we've got, you know, there's lots of thinking that people are doing about that. That's a pretty long road to try to undo it, because we got some Supreme Court precedent and lots of true believers in the Chicago school that we have to do. In the meantime, though, we can move other levers to try to build competition, and those are all things that we have to do all of them at once.
I feel like 40 years ago, we snapped off the lever for antitrust and threw it out the window. And so we know where the copyright lever is, and we know where the privacy lever is, and we know where all these other levers are, and we're yanking on them as hard as we can. You know, in the European Union, they're trying to make this bonkers copyright rule that says that everyone has to filter everything on the internet to make sure it doesn't infringe copyright, on the grounds that maybe that will make Google pay more for YouTube videos. And really what it's going to do is make Google the only company that can afford to host video, because everyone else is going to need a $500 million filter. And like, this is not going to make artists' negotiating position with Google better, right? They're just going to, like, the fact that they know where there's a copyright lever doesn't mean that yanking on it is going to solve their problem. And the fact that nobody is thinking about this competition side means that we're all just, you know, to switch metaphors, we're all just like looking under the lamppost for our keys because it's too dark where we drop them, you know?
Well, we started out by talking about crypto, and we finished by talking about capitalism. So I think we covered all the bases here. So I think we'll wind up. We will be here. You can ask us more questions. This is Cindy Cohn. This is Cory Doctorow. I'm Annalee Newitz.